I never believed in mysterious creatures, at least not until 3 months ago. Now, every morning when I wake up, I can't help but replay what I saw in those mountains and wonder if I should have handled things differently. What I'm about to tell you may sound unbelievable, but I swear on my mother's grave that every word is true. I've been flying bush planes in northern British Columbia for 15 years, mostly hauling supplies to logging camps, flying hunters out to remote cabins, and occasionally doing search and rescue work. It's honest work, though it barely pays the bills. My little charter outfit was already on shaky ground when all of this began. Tommy, not his real name, and we'll keep it that way, had been flying with me for about 5 years. I first met him when he was guiding hunters and needed transportation to far-off camps. He knew the wilderness better than anyone I'd ever met, could track anything, identify plants that might kill you, and stay calm no matter the crisis. When money got tight, I started bringing him along as a spotter. 2 sets of eyes are always better than one when you're flying over backcountry where one mistake can get you killed. Early October, he walked into my hangar. He didn't look like he belonged there at all, dressed sharp, wearing an expensive watch, with a haircut worth more than most folks make in a week. Standing among grease stains and scattered spare parts, he looked out of place. He introduced himself as a representative of a private corporation that was having problems with their remote operations in the Cassiar Mountains. Over the past 6 months, they had lost contact with 3 separate field teams. Equipment went missing, camps had been ransacked, and 2 researchers had vanished without a trace. He wanted me to run aerial reconnaissance flights over a specific grid, take detailed photographs of anything unusual, and report back with my findings. The pay was generous, $5,000 per flight, guaranteed minimum of 10 flights. That was more money than I had made in the last 3 months combined. Both Tommy and I were there when he pitched the idea, and I could tell we were thinking the same thing. Nobody pays that kind of money for simple aerial photography unless there's a lot more to the story. But when you're 2 months behind on hangar rent and the bank's threatening to repossess your plane, you don't look too closely at gifts like that. We should have asked more questions. We should have wondered why a geological survey company needed a bush pilot instead of a professional aerial photographer. We should have questioned why they were so secretive about the true nature of the work. But the money was too good to pass up. The area they wanted covered was deep wilderness, even by northern BC standards. No roads, no settlements, nothing but endless forest broken by sheer granite peaks and the occasional alpine lake. The GPS coordinates they gave us marked a stretch of roughly 20 square miles that looked untouched by human hands. My co-pilot rode along on every flight, managing the camera gear while I focused on flying the grid routes they'd mapped out for us. His sharp eyes caught details I would have missed from the pilot's seat, and his knack for reading the terrain helped us pick up on subtle signs that something wasn't right. The first few flights turned up nothing unusual. Thick spruce and pine canopy, a few clearings from lightning strikes or avalanches, and the usual wildlife you'd expect to spot from the air. We photographed everything systematically, following the flight paths exactly as instructed. But by the 4th run, things started to feel off. We noticed trails cutting through areas where no trails should have been. Not animal paths, these looked deliberate, wide enough for something large to move through. Some of the clearings we'd written off as natural started showing signs of systematic tree cutting, with logs stacked in almost geometric patterns. We pointed out broken branches at heights no known animal could reach clean breaks, 8 or 9 meters off the ground, as if something tall and impossibly strong had forced its way through without bothering to go around. The strangest part? There was no sign at all of the survey teams supposedly working in the area. No camps, no equipment, no helicopter pads. For a company claiming to have lost 3 separate crews out there, there was shockingly little evidence that anyone had ever been there in the first place. By the 6th flight, things started to take a turn for the worse. About an hour into that reconnaissance run, my radio started picking up interference deep, pulsing bursts that didn't match any frequency I knew. At first, I blamed the atmosphere, but the pattern was too steady, too deliberate. It sounded almost like some kind of primitive drum beat. We tried every knob and setting on the radio, but the interference stayed with us. No matter what frequency we switched to, the static spiked over certain parts of the grid as if the source of it was somewhere below us, buried in the trees. Then my compass began to act up. Each time we crossed those same areas, the needle spun wildly, making navigation nearly impossible. I was forced to rely solely on GPS, a thought that made my stomach tighten, given how remote the terrain was. On the flight back, the engine began running rough, forcing me to throttle up and nurse it along at minimum power. Back at base, my mechanic couldn't find a single thing wrong. Every system checked out perfectly, but I knew something wasn't right. I brought up the problems with our contact when we sent over that day's photos. He didn't seem the least bit surprised about the radio or compass issues, which was, in its own way, another red flag. Instead, he simply nodded and said they'd gotten similar reports from their field teams before losing contact with them. That night, Tommy and I talked it over and agreed something about this job didn't add up. The equipment glitches, the total lack of evidence of any missing teams, the evasive answers from the client whenever we pressed for details. All of it pointed to us being used for something far different from what we'd been told. But the money was real, and we needed it. We decided to finish out the contract while keeping our eyes open for any sign we were walking into a trap. 3 days later, on what was supposed to be our final reconnaissance flight, everything went south. About halfway through the run, the engine started to fail hard. Oil pressure dropped to nearly zero, and I could see smoke curling up from the exhaust stacks. My co-pilot had his binoculars out, scanning the terrain below for anything remotely resembling a landing site. The forest stretched unbroken in every direction, split only by knife-edged granite peaks too steep and narrow to touch down on. I figured we had maybe 10 minutes before the engine quit entirely. Then, looking down at that endless canopy, we spotted a small lake with a narrow strip of beach on the eastern shore. It was the only shot we had for an emergency landing. The approach was brutal. Trees crowded the water's edge on 3 sides, leaving me only a thin gap to thread the plane through. My co-pilot called out altitude and airspeed numbers as I fought to keep the aircraft steady on a dying engine. We hit the water harder than I wanted, the impact wrecking the propeller and bending the landing gear struts. The plane was still afloat, but only just, and it wasn't going to fly us out of there. We taxied toward the beach and managed to drag the aircraft up onto dry ground before it could sink or drift away. My emergency locator beacon should have triggered automatically, but when we checked the unit, the antenna had been sheared off in the landing. We were completely cut off from the outside world. I stepped out of the plane around 3 in the afternoon, leaving us just a few daylight hours to assess our situation and build a shelter. Our emergency kit held enough food and water for about 3 days if we rationed carefully. Using the plane as a windbreak, we rigged a makeshift tarp shelter and gathered enough firewood to get us through the night. The temperature began to drop as the sun slid behind the mountains, and we knew it would dip below freezing before morning. I let my co-pilot take the lead on camp setup. He'd always been the better outdoorsman while I inspected the plane and tried to figure out any way to get us back out under our own power. While gathering wood, we stumbled onto something that froze us cold. In the soft mud along the lake's edge were tracks unlike anything we'd ever seen. They were huge, at least 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches across with 5 clear toes. Whatever made them had been heavy enough to sink deep into the mud, and the stride length suggested something far taller than any human. We just stood there, staring at those prints for a long time, saying nothing. Both of us had seen just about every animal track you can imagine, and we were equally stumped. These weren't bear tracks. Bears don't leave prints with 5 distinct toes like that, and neither of us had ever seen a bear track anywhere near that size. But neither of us was ready to jump to a more extraordinary explanation. That first night was the longest of my life. We built the fire big and kept it blazing, but sleep was impossible. Around midnight, we began hearing noises from the tree line that made every hair on our bodies stand on end. Heavy footfalls circled our camp just beyond the glow of the flames. Branches snapped under a tremendous weight. The sound was steady, deliberate. Whatever was making it was smart enough to stay just out of sight. Every so often, we caught brief flashes of reflected eyes watching us from the darkness. But whenever we tried to catch them in our flashlight beams, there was nothing there. Those eyes seemed far higher off the ground than any known animal, and they reflected our light with an eerie, burning yellow glow. We had our weapons ready, his .30-06 hunting rifle and my .44 revolver I always carried in the bush. We sat back to back by the fire, guns in hand, scanning the tree line for movement. Whatever was out there seemed curious, not aggressive. It never came closer than about 50 yards from our fire, and we had the distinct impression it was studying us more than stalking us. The sounds suggested multiple individuals moving through the forest, coordinating their movements in ways that hinted at some kind of sophisticated communication. Knowing that didn't make it any less terrifying. We were dealing with intelligent, unknown beings on their own turf, completely cut off from any hope of rescue. Only the campfire and a couple of guns stood between us and whatever was out there in the dark. We took turns keeping watch, though neither of us really slept. Every noise from the woods snapped us to full alert, weapons raised. But whatever was tracking us seemed content to watch from a distance. As dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded back into the forest. When daylight finally broke, we discovered our uninvited guests had been busy. Our camp had been carefully examined, clear evidence that something big and intelligent had inspected every piece of gear we'd left outside. Our emergency supplies had been moved, but not taken, neatly arranged into small, orderly piles as if someone or something had been studying each item to understand its purpose. The methodical organization was deeply unsettling. Now, tracks were everywhere, dozens of massive footprints circling the camp and leading off into the woods in multiple directions. A closer look showed at least 3 distinct sets of prints, meaning we were dealing with a group, not just one individual. Most disturbing of all were the handprints we found on the plane itself. They stood out clearly in the morning frost on the wings and fuselage, hands unmistakably shaped like human hands, but far larger than any human could possess. The fingers were thick and powerful, with claw-like tips. The way the prints were placed told us the maker had been exploring the aircraft handprints on the propeller, the wing struts, the door handles, as if it had been trying to understand how our machine worked. We tried to convince ourselves there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe some of the survey team had survived whatever happened and gone feral in the wilderness, which would account for the primitive behavior and the oversized tracks. But deep down, we both knew we were fooling ourselves. No human could leave handprints that size. No human could move silently through dense forest the way whatever was out there had. We were facing something that didn't fit into any known category of wildlife. We spent most of that morning checking and rechecking our weapons, clearing lines of fire from the camp, and talking through what we'd do if whatever was out there decided to approach us in daylight. The second day was worse than the first. Even in full sun, we kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees, massive shapes that seemed to be shadowing us from behind the trunks or from high perches on the surrounding slopes. Through the binoculars, we tried to get a better look, but whatever was out there was too clever to fully show itself. All we ever caught were fragments, a curtain of dark hair, an enormous shoulder, sometimes what looked like a face peeking out from cover, but never long enough to make out details. The psychological pressure was brutal. Knowing we were being watched, studied by minds we couldn't begin to understand, wound us both tighter than I'd ever been in my life. Every sound made us whip around. Every flicker of shadow sent our hearts racing. We found ourselves constantly looking over our shoulders. By afternoon, we were exhausted from hours of high-alert tension. We'd been gripping our weapons so long, our fingers felt glued to the triggers, ready to defend ourselves from a threat we still couldn't clearly identify. Around that time, we began to think maybe, just maybe, whatever was out there wasn't outright hostile. The fact that it hadn't attacked us at night, when we were most vulnerable, suggested its intentions might not be aggressive. The careful arrangement of our gear felt more like curiosity than malice, but that didn't make us feel much safer. We were up against something clearly larger and stronger than we were, something that could slip through the forest like a ghost and was smart enough to study us systematically while staying hidden. Even if it wasn't acting hostile yet, that didn't mean it wouldn't become dangerous if it felt threatened. The watching went on all day, with different positions around the camp seemingly taken up at different times, like shifts on a watch. It was obvious we were dealing with a coordinated group sharing information about us in ways we couldn't comprehend. Late in the afternoon of that second day, things came to a head. We were working near the plane when my co-pilot suddenly grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. There, half hidden behind a massive pine about 100 yards away, stood the clearest view we'd yet had of whatever had been stalking us. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall and built like a heavyweight prizefighter. Its entire body was covered in thick, coarse, dark brown hair built for mountain cold. Its proportions were human-like but exaggerated. Massive shoulders, long arms, a powerful chest that radiated raw strength. But it was the face that stunned us. Though clearly not human, its deep-set eyes held an unmistakable intelligence. The face was a mix of man and ape, with a heavy brow and a jutting jaw, yet the eyes were contemplative, curious, almost analytical. Instinctively, both of us raised our weapons, shouldering the rifle and drawing the revolver. The creature made no aggressive move, but it didn't retreat either. We stood locked in a tense standoff, our guns trained on an impossible being while it studied us with a calm curiosity. I had the rifle's sights centered on its chest, my finger resting on the trigger, One wrong move from that thing and we would have fired without hesitation. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But the creature only stood there, looking at us with those intelligent eyes. It showed no fear of our weapons, which was maybe the most frightening thing of all. Either it didn't recognize the threat, or it was so confident in its own power it simply didn't care. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, it tilted its head slightly, as if weighing a decision. Then it stepped forward just enough for us to see it clearly, and raised one massive hand in a gesture that could only be described as a wave. The movement was so unexpected, so unmistakably human, that it completely took us off guard. We held our ground for a few more seconds. Then the creature simply stepped back behind the tree and vanished into the forest, as quietly as it had appeared. When we finally lowered our rifles, both of us were shaking from the adrenaline. We had just come face to face with something that shouldn't exist, and it had tried to communicate with us. That evening, as we sat by the campfire talking over what we'd seen, the deeper implications started to sink in. This wasn't just some unknown animal. It was clearly an intelligent being, with complex behavior and what seemed like an advanced level of awareness. We went over every detail of the encounter that we had both noticed. Its stance was alert but not aggressive. Its body language showed curiosity more than hostility. Most striking of all, it didn't show fear of our weapons, if anything. It made deliberate attempts to reach out. And the more we thought about it, the more we realized we weren't dealing with just one creature. Throughout the encounter, we noticed differences in size and behavior, suggesting multiple individuals were present. There seemed to be some kind of social structure at work, with different members of the group taking turns to watch us. The more we compared notes, the clearer it became. They were scouting us the same way we had been scouting their territory. The difference was, they were better at hiding than we were at spotting them. The effort to communicate had been unmistakable. The raised hand, the tilted head, the deliberate move into a more visible position. Those weren't random actions. They were the gestures of an intelligent being trying to establish peaceful contact. But that raised as many questions as it answered. If they were smart enough to communicate, what did they want? Were they simply curious about strangers trespassing in their territory, or was there something more? By the third day at the lake, both of us had reached the same conclusion. Whatever these beings were, they weren't going to hurt us unless we gave them a reason to. Their behavior was too consistent, too measured, and too controlled for them to be mindless predators. So we began leaving small offerings at the edge of camp. Energy bars, dried fruit from our rations, even a spare multi-tool we could part with. Every gift was taken during the night, and in the morning, we would find something left behind. The items showed deliberate thought and intent, smooth stones arranged in geometric patterns that couldn't have been natural, bundles of roots and edible berries we recognized as local food, even strips of smoked fish or small cuts of game preserved with fire. It was clear they were trying to establish some kind of peaceful exchange, and we decided to answer in kind. The tension eased noticeably. We still kept our weapons close, but we no longer scanned the tree line every minute expecting a threat. The breakthrough came on the fourth morning. When we woke, 3 large salmon cleaned and ready to cook had been laid out neatly on a bed of pine boughs near our shelter. It was an unmistakable gesture of goodwill. We accepted it in the spirit it was given, roasted 1 fish over the fire, and left the other 2 at the camp's edge as our return gift. Later, when we checked, the fish were gone, replaced with a handful of late-season blueberries and a bundle of herbs we recognized from survival training. This back and forth continued for days, growing more detailed and meaningful each time. Each morning we found food, tools, or useful materials left for us. In return, we shared what little we could spare from our dwindling supplies. It wasn't exactly conversation, but it was communication, and more importantly, it was trust being built. Whoever or whatever these beings were, they showed care and intelligence that couldn't be ignored. They shared knowledge of their land, gave us food and medicine, and in their own way, looked out for us while we remained in their territory. On our 5th day at the lake, the largest of them approached closer than any had before. This one was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, as wide as a tree trunk. The way it moved, and the respect the others showed when it appeared, made it clear we were finally looking at the leader of the group. It moved to within 30 feet of our fire and simply stood there, seemingly content to watch us go about our morning routine. Up close, we could make out details that were both fascinating and unnerving. Its face was an astonishing blend of human and ape-thick brow ridges, framing deeply expressive eyes that held unmistakable intelligence and, what I can only call wisdom. Its fur was uneven, shorter and darker around the face and hands, longer and lighter across the body. Streaks of gray showed at the temples and in the beard, marking it as an older individual with years of experience. We stayed calm, keeping our weapons visible but not threatening, while we went about our chores, checking the plane, servicing gear, tending the fire under the watchful gaze of this remarkable being, which studied our every movement with clear curiosity. When I raised my hand, hoping it was a universal sign of greeting, the creature tilted its head and made a series of soft, complex sounds, an apparent attempt to communicate. The tones shifted in pitch and rhythm, suggesting a sophisticated language. When my co-pilot pointed to himself and said his name, the creature mimicked the pointing gesture and uttered a different sequence of sounds, perhaps its own name, or some form of acknowledgement. It was a moment I'll never forget, two entirely different species trying to bridge the gap between them. Over the next hour, we developed a rudimentary system of communication through gestures and simple sounds. The creature seemed especially interested in our aircraft, spending long periods watching it from a distance, though it never came close enough to touch. Its study of our technology was deliberate and obviously intelligent. When we demonstrated basic tools, striking a match, cutting rope with a knife, it observed with intense focus, then made vocalizations as if sharing these observations with others still hidden nearby. Most striking of all, it showed no fear whatsoever. It clearly understood our weapons could be dangerous, yet it displayed no anxiety about us using them. Either it was supremely confident in its own abilities or it understood something about our intentions that we hadn't yet managed to convey. On our 6th day at the lake, while the Alpha watched from its usual spot at the edge of camp, I made a discovery that changed everything. While reorganizing our first aid kit, I found a tiny electronic device buried under the medical supplies, something I had never seen before. About the size of a matchbox, it had a stubby antenna and a blinking LED light. It was clearly a tracking device, but not one from any emergency gear I recognized. Someone had planted it among our equipment before the flight. I showed it to my co-pilot, and the implications hit us like a hammer. The engine trouble, the compass interference, the radio static, none of it had been random. We'd been set up from the start. Our mission wasn't about geological surveys or locating missing research teams. We had been lured into a trap designed to flush out whatever lived in these mountains. As if to confirm our worst fears, my handheld radio suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission. I recognized the voice of our supposed liaison, but now the tone was unmistakably military. Multiple aircraft, ground teams with specialized equipment, orders to converge on our location at dawn. They weren't coming to rescue us, they were coming to seize whatever we had found. But there was one crucial detail in our favor. The transmission spoke of an operation at dawn, and it was already late afternoon. We had about 12 hours to warn the creatures and figure out what to do. We looked at each other, then at the giant beings still watching from the trees. Somehow, we had to warn them, but how could we possibly convey ideas as complex as betrayal, hunters, and the danger that was about to descend on them? We decided we couldn't just sit and wait for dawn. The thought of those teams swooping in with helicopters, weapons, and containment gear turned our stomachs. These beings weren't monsters. They were intelligent, social, and, in their own way, compassionate. Letting them walk blindly into an ambush felt like betrayal. But how do you warn a species you barely know how to talk to? We tried everything we could think of, gestures, drawings in the dirt, even acting out scenarios. My co-pilot mimed being chased, pointing to the horizon, then to the sky, trying to suggest danger coming from above. The Alpha watched closely, its great head tilting side to side, deep-set eyes following every motion. Other figures shifted in the tree line, restless but silent. Finally, I picked up the tracking device we'd found. I held it out toward them, tapped the blinking light, then made an exaggerated gesture of pointing skyward and covering my head. I mimed fear, then pointed back to the forest, urging them to retreat deeper into the mountains. The Alpha's eyes narrowed. For a long moment, it seemed to weigh what we were trying to show. Then it let out a low, rumbling call that carried through the trees. Shapes moved, shadows melting away into the forest as if the order had been understood. The Alpha lingered, still studying us. Then, with a deliberate slowness, it reached to its side and placed a hand against its chest, as though marking itself. It repeated the gesture, then pointed at me. A shiver ran down my spine. It was acknowledging me, recognizing me as something more than just a stranger. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving us alone with the fire and the heavy weight of the coming hours. That night was the longest of my life. Every crackle in the underbrush, every gust of wind, every whisper of sound put me on edge. Sleep was impossible. We sat by the fire, weapons loaded, waiting. Just before dawn, the distant thump of rotor blades rolled across the mountains. A cold knot formed in my stomach. They were coming. The commander of the special operation was relentless with his questions. He kept circling back to the same points. Did we see anything moving upright? Did we see any sign of tool use or intelligence? Any attempts at communication? We stuck to our storybear tracks, maybe wolves, nothing more than what you'd expect to find in a remote wilderness. But we could see it in their eyes. They suspected we were holding something back. The questioning grew sharper, more focused, and we began to worry they might resort to harsher interrogation tactics. For 3 days, they combed the area around the lake with increasingly sophisticated gear: ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, motion sensors, even what looked like an acoustic array designed to pick up and analyze unusual sounds. Of course, they found nothing. Whatever intelligence these beings possessed, it was more than enough to avoid human technology. As the search teams clattered through the forest, making enough noise to wake the dead, the creatures we'd lived alongside for a week remained completely invisible. By the second day, one of the searchers claimed to have found large tracks about a mile from our camp. We were brought in to take a look. The prints were real, made by the very beings that had visited us nightly, but they were isolated, as if someone had intentionally left a single trail to suggest movement through the area before vanishing. The search coordinator looked irritated, but not surprised. He said they'd had similar results at other sites, tantalizing signs of presence, but never enough hard evidence to prove anything. My co-pilot and I exchanged glances, but said nothing. We knew exactly why the search was failing. These beings were simply too smart to be caught with standard tracking methods. They had melted back into their territory, leaving only what they wanted to be found. 3 days later, we were back at my hangar with a $50,000 check and a non-disclosure agreement that made it clear the story wasn't over. We were instructed to report any future encounters with unusual wildlife in the region. Any photos, recordings, or other evidence of abnormal animal behavior had to be turned over immediately. The money solved our immediate financial problems, but it came with a price. Now we knew there were powerful interests actively hunting these remarkable beings, and we were expected to help. That was 3 months ago. Since then, I've flown dozens of routine missions across northern British Columbia, but I've never been asked to return to the Cassiar Mountains. I don't know if the operation has been shut down or if they've found another way to monitor the area. What I do know is that we think about those beings every day. We wonder if they're still living peacefully in their hidden valleys or if other teams have been more successful at tracking them down. We wonder if we did the right thing by protecting them, or if we should have tried to establish a more official contact. Above all, we think of the Alpha, the one who spent hours watching us from the edge of camp. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable, and the trust it showed by coming so close is something neither of us will ever forget. They weren't mindless beasts or some evolutionary dead end. They were, in the truest sense, people, just people who happened to look different from us. Sometimes, on clear days with the light just right, we think we catch a glimpse of something moving through the treetops. Whether that's truly them or just our imagination, we can't be sure. But it gives us hope they're still out there, still free, still living life on their own terms. If you happen to fly over the backcountry and see something that doesn't fit what you know of the natural world, my advice is this: watch quietly, respect what you see, and keep it to yourself. Some mysteries deserve to stay mysteries, and some beings deserve their freedom.